Because most of the time the child is engaged in the process or the campaign to denigrate the other parent. So the child is convinced somehow that he or she was abused, even though it's not true. So the child is having to perpetuate the accusation that's not true, which can't be good for the child. So you have to brainwash the child into actually believing it for them to perpetuate it. Or in the case of maybe older children, they know that they're perpetuating a lie, but they do it anyway because they get something out of it, right?
Hey, this is Diane Dirks.
And I'm Rick Voiles.
We've been working with co-parents in conflict for more than 2 decades. We've taught classes, written books, counseled parents, empathized, and agonized a few times to help people make sense of their complicated families.
We were talking one day, and it occurred to us that helping the most difficult cases comes down to one simple concept. Is one parent willing to let go of the tug-of-war rope, or is it worth it to hold on and fight?
So we invite you to take this journey with us each episode as we tackle the questions, should you hold on or let it go?
Welcome to Co-Parent Dilemmas, where we give you practical solutions to those impossible co-parents. Hello, Rick.
Hi, Diane.
How are you doing?
I am good. We had a good weekend, celebrated Janet's birthday.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't know. Tell her I said happy birthday.
I will tell her that. Yes.
All right, good. Yeah, things are good here too. It's rainy today. Yuck. But we kind of need it, so I'm okay with it. Yeah. So this Wednesday, we are allowing free Patreon subscribers to attend our Hump Day Help group. And so, Rick, if you don't mind, explain to our listeners what the Hump Day Help group is that happens every Wednesday.
It's a service where a group of parents who are in the midst of very high conflict and very difficult co-parenting situations get together and support each other. And it's really phenomenal to watch how they lift each other up. They share stories. Yes, I know what you're going through. Yes, that happened to me. And the result of that, of feeling like I'm not alone out there, people understand what I'm going through when nobody else in my family or around me does or could possibly understand, because they have no relatable experience. But to get into a group with people who have relatable experience can be comforting and validating and very supportive.
Yeah, it's awesome. And one of us is typically there, and we are open to answering questions as well, or leading the group in discussions. So I find that it's not only helpful to them, but it's also helpful to us. It helps us keep our thumb on the pulse of what's happening in the co-parent world. So if you're interested, to become a VIP is only $10 a month. So I don't think you're going to get any kind of experience like this for that little amount. So we really encourage y'all to do it. But if you just want to try it out for one more week, we're going to be doing it for all of our Patreon subscribers, even those who subscribe for free. So check it out at patreon.com/CP Dilemmas. So Rick, I have a good news story. It's reminiscent of Jonah and the whale. Do you remember that old Bible story?
I do.
You do. What is the story of Jonah and the whale?
Jonah gets swallowed by a whale, and then because he's running away from his task that he's supposed to do, and then the whale swallows him and then spits him out where he's supposed to be.
Well, I have a story of a real-life Jonah.
No.
Yes. On Friday, June 11th, 56-year-old Wellfleet, Massachusetts resident Michael Packard wasn't fleeing the wrath of God when he dove into the waters. He was diving for lobster. But in a straight out of Jaws scenario, like Jonah before him, in one fell swoop, Packard found himself seemingly in the belly of the beast, a humpback whale's mouth.
Whoa.
All of a sudden, I felt this huge shove, and the next thing I knew, it was completely black, Packard told the Cape Cod Times. I could sense I was moving, and I could feel the whale squeezing the muscles in his mouth. Ugh. Packard's first terrifying thought as he struggled in the darkness was that he'd been scarfed down by a great white shark. While it didn't take him long to realize the gullet in which he was uncomfortably lodged belonged to a whale rather than a toothy shark. His prospects for survival did not look good. However, thrashing its head, the whale made for the surface in a major hurry, where it speedily spat the gobsmacked Packard back into the briny water. The entire episode took under a minute, but it was enough for Packard to see his life flash before his eyes. He said, I was completely inside. It was completely black. I thought to myself, there's no way I'm getting out of here. I'm done. I'm dead. All I could think of was my boys, who are 12 and 15 years old. Although he suffered a dislocated knee and a great deal of soft tissue damage, for a lobster man who'd been recently ingested and disgorged by a 25-ton mammal, Packard survived the encounter remarkably intact and is thankful to be alive.
Wow. I
Wow.
can't imagine what that would be like.
Who knew the hazards of being a lobster man?
I would never have the wherewithal to recognize a gullet in the midst of something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, that's pretty amazing. It doesn't really say what caused the whale to spat him out. Maybe he just didn't taste very good. I don't know.
Got stuck in his throat somehow. Yeah.
Something. Anyway, that's a terrifying story, but the good news is that he survived, could tell about it. And
I can imagine somewhere there's a whale going home and telling the family about, and I lived. I almost choked to death, but I lived.
to death.
Yeah.
Yes. So what we're going to talk about today may feel like that to many of our listeners. Being kind of swallowed by a whale and not understanding what is happening. So fairly recently, and really probably for the last few years, I've dealt with some clients and even some of the people on our Hump Day Wednesday group who have been falsely accused of some sort of abuse, falsely accused maybe of physical or sexual abuse, falsely accused of alienating their children. And I think when that happens, it is kind of blindsiding, sort of like this guy in the whale. You're like, all of a sudden you're in the belly of a whale and you're thinking, what is happening here? So I thought it might be helpful to some of our listeners to not only affirm their experience and how very, very difficult this is, but talk a little bit about maybe how the professional and legal world hasn't really caught up with this yet.
Mm-hmm.
Or even how culturally, I think we have a tendency to not protect those who are falsely accused because we become really sensitive to what if it's true.
Right.
So this is not going to be an easy discussion, and it's not simple to discuss because there are complexities on both sides, especially when children are involved, right?
Yeah.
So I think in the legal world and even with professionals, there's a fear of liability if I get it wrong. So what if one parent is accusing the other of child abuse? What happens if I don't believe it that it's true? What happens if I do believe it and it's not true?
Mm.
And which would have the worst outcome? And I don't think you and I have been in these positions. It's not often easy to know, but it does take a certain amount of training. And, I'm a stickler about training, right?
Right.
Don't put your toe in this water unless you've been adequately trained, because you could do a lot of damage as a professional. But I feel even more strongly about maybe judges that aren't really trained. And oftentimes they then rely on those who are trained, which they should. But oftentimes they're relying on professionals who are not trained either.
Right.
And then poor decisions get made and parents get hurt, children get hurt, more than anything. So I want to say this, I guess, to start off, and then I'll let you kind of respond. You know, if a child is truly being abused, then the best thing can happen is that the child is believed and some remedy is put into place. Would you agree?
Yes.
Whether that remedy is you no longer are exposed to that parent or that parent receives some sort of help to stop the abuse. But even then, it can be traumatizing for a child, for instance, if the abuse is sexual in nature.
Right.
That even if the parent gets the help they need, that doesn't necessarily mean that the child is going to want to reengage. Or that the child should reengage, right? It depends on the severity, I think, and the nature of and how long it happened. And there's just all kinds of variables that play into whether or not it would be good for a child to reengage with a sexual predator as a parent in any way, shape, or form. But I think with physical abuse, again, depending on the severity, that parents can get help and learn how to use other tools than corporal punishment, for instance, and that a child and parent can be reunited after the fact. I almost think, and this is the reason why I wanted to talk about it today, that it's more egregious when a parent is being falsely accused and the accusations are believed, because it not only hurts the parent, but also hurts the child.
Right.
Because most of the time, the child is engaged in the process or the campaign to denigrate the other parent. So the child is convinced somehow that he or she was abused, even though it's not true. So the child is having to perpetuate the accusation that's not true, which can't be good for the child. So you have to brainwash the child into actually believing it for them to perpetuate it.
Mm.
Or in the case of maybe older children, they know that they're perpetuating a lie, but they do it anyway because they get something out of it, right?
Yeah.
And then, it's unimaginable to a parent to be falsely accused and then have the system support that. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, it's terribly complicated. Like you said at the beginning, if it's actually happening and I don't do anything, then that's the wrong move. But if it's not happening and I do something, like take the child away from a parent who's been accused, but it's a false allegation. I think the biggest problem is how long they take trying to make a decision about whether the allegations are true or not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, either way, if I've made the mistake taking the child away because it's false accusations and it's taken 2 years
Mm-hmm.
to figure it out, then I've done damage. If I've decided it's not true and left the child with an abuser and it's taking me 2 years to figure it out, then I've damaged the child. This 2 years is the consistency that needs to change.
Right.
There needs to be a separate process on these things where we can quickly evaluate and quickly make it as best decision as we can and take action.
Right. Oftentimes there's an emergency hearing asked for, which makes sense if there are accusations of child abuse, and they get a hearing really quickly. But in that hearing, it's determined that the child will be taken away from the parent until further notice.
And then you got 2 years.
And then you get and I think we talked about this somewhat in the case from hell, remember?
Yes.
That, once there was an accusation made, the child was taken away, and then it took how many years for the custody evaluator to get involved and make some sort of determination about the abuse. And by that time, the child had been with the brainwashing parent so long that the accusations seemed very real to the children, and they had a hard time letting go of them. So I totally agree with you. The time that it takes, where is the emergency? What happens to the emergency after the emergency hearing?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Hey listeners, the response to the daily devotional for frustrated co-parents has been a pleasant surprise. The feedback I'm getting is that it helps to put co-parent issues in a biblical context and provides an additional and more peaceful challenge to do right by the children. If you've not yet subscribed, you can do so by following the link in the show notes. An option for a 7-day free trial is available, so you can test it out and see if this new start to your day gives you a little more peace about being a non-impossible.
Right. So I think it's important to talk about as well, what are some indicators that there are false accusations. So there's some gender issues here. Men are more likely to be accused or rightly accused or falsely accused of sexual or physical abuse of children. Women are more likely to be falsely accused or rightly accused of parental alienation, which can be a form of child abuse as well.
True.
So with both sides knowing that, we tend to see false accusations of women and parental alienation and false accusations of men and physical or sexual child abuse. There's also a link between domestic violence and parental alienation. So, and let me explain that a little bit. For instance, if there has been accusations of domestic violence, whether true or false, from a woman who's saying a man abused me in the marriage, that woman is more likely to alienate that man from the children.
Okay.
Simply
Yeah.
because of the domestic violence component. So there is a link between that whether the mother has simply accused the dad and it's false of hurting her in the marriage, or it really did happen in the marriage, she will use that as a jumping point in a divorce case to claim that the kids should not see the father because of his prior acts of abuse towards her.
Yeah.
So there's a link there. I think a few of the things that lead us toward a false accusation, or to uncover, I should say, a false accusation, is lack of evidence. So let's talk about a false accusation of parental alienation, for instance. A mother, for instance, saying bad things about a father, he may say, well, that's parental alienation, right?
Right.
That can be a component of parental alienation, but that one component doesn't necessarily equal parental alienation.
No.
So we know that there are several, I think, 14 kind of identified behaviors that identify or describe what parental alienation is all about. And I'll put a link to an article like that in the show notes. So not having enough of those present would indicate maybe this is a false accusation. Because people read things on the internet, and, if your ex-spouse does this or your co-parent does that, then they're alienating you from the child.
Right.
Another component of false accusations of parental alienation is when a parent actually is alienating him or herself from the children on their own.
Yes.
Right? Like, my kids don't want to see me, so I'm going to automatically blame the other parent, but maybe they don't want to see me because the last time they were at my house, I was drunk all weekend.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe I got a little belligerent, and maybe that scares them, and maybe they have a good reason for not wanting to come to my house.
Nobody wants to be at your house, right?
Right. So when we do things that alienate ourselves from our child, but aren't willing to acknowledge that, it's kind of an easy play to say, well, it's the other parent who's alienating. So that would be a lack of true evidence that it's actually happening, right? Timing is also a factor to look at in determining whether something is true or false. When did the accusations begin? Oh, they began the very week after a court filing. Or they began a month after he got remarried.
Yep.
Or they began pretty quickly after mom got a new boyfriend.
Or pregnant.
So if we look at events and we can tie some of the accusations or the court filings to that, then it should raise a red flag,
Yeah.
right? Hmm. Maybe this is in reaction to this life event and not necessarily a form of abuse actually happening. We see that a lot, even with kids. You know, when you talk to a kid who's been alienated and we start to understand or feel like it's a false accusation, oftentimes the child will bring up something that happened 5 years ago when the parents were still married
Hmm.
instead of something that's happening in present day, which usually is an indicator that they're being coached about that. Oh, your dad's a horrible person. Remember that time when,
Yeah.
he threw that cup at my head or whatever. They'll come up with something and then the child will use that story over and over and over as the reason why my parent is a bad, bad man, or the reason why I can't see him because I'm afraid of him. I've had kids tell me that they were afraid of a parent because of something that happened when they were very young and likely it wasn't impactful enough for them to even remember,
Remember. Yeah.
which tells you that, again, they've been told about it, they've been coached about it. So I think those things are important too, is what is the timing of all of the accusations? And then obviously inconsistency. When, a child, on one hand, you witness them being very loving to a parent, but then when they go back to their other parent, they're saying bad things about that other parent, obviously to please the one who's maybe in alienation mode. And so we look for those inconsistencies as well. Is on one hand, they're saying this, on the other hand, they're doing that. Do those things match up? So I think court professionals often miss signs of false allegations and maybe even fear retaliation if they don't side with the loudest litigant. The
Retaliation
one,
from who?
well, I don't know,
Mm.
from the system. I don't know. Um, why would a court believe a false allegation over wanting to know if it's true?
Oh, I see what you're saying. They're going to take the safe route for themselves necessarily. The easiest decision right now in order to get this case moving, or so that it doesn't go to appeal, or they don't get, the judge doesn't get accused of something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
possibly.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, if I get it wrong and then the child ends up dead,
Right.
then doesn't look so good on me, or I didn't feel so good,
Right.
right? But I think this is where the cultural stuff comes in a little bit. If we harken back to the Me Too movement, which, I had a story to tell. So many women had a story to tell that you finally felt like, okay, I'm allowed to talk about this now. And we all did, and it was a good thing. But what happens on the heels of a good thing like that typically?
Oh, somebody corrupts it. Somebody
Yeah,
leverages it to their evil benefit. Yeah.
right. It becomes easily weaponized. And I really think that things like parental alienation, especially, has become weaponized to that
Oh,
degree.
definitely.
Or even child abuse,
Yep.
that, you know, if you work with child protective services at all, you will learn pretty quickly that as soon as they learn there's a child custody hearing going on, they kind of roll their eyes and go, well, call me when that's over. They pretty much don't believe
Right.
it, which is kind of sad because what if it's really happening?
Yeah.
The reason they don't believe it is because they have had so many experiences where that kind of thing has been weaponized in a child custody case.
Yes.
And they really have a hard time taking it seriously, which is really sad if it is happening. But I think it's equally sad for the courts to err on the side of caution with parental alienation if they do, or even accusations from a parental alienator, accusations of abuse, that they side with that alienator and, like you said, take the kids away from a parent who's not done anything wrong because they're so afraid of making the wrong decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a tough balance for those of us who've been jaded by this, as opposed to those who don't understand it and would err on the side of caution.
Do we have any statistics that identify if this happens less or more in a real family court system? I know here in Georgia, we don't have a real family court system.
That's a good question. I don't know that. But the difference between a superior court system and a family court
Right.
system
Yeah.
is supposedly in the family court system, judges are only dealing with family law cases,
Yeah.
which one would presume that means they're better trained in
Yes.
family law dynamics,
Yes.
right? Which presumably means there would be more professionals who worked consistently with the family court who were better trained, but
Mhm.
I don't know if that's true. That's a good question, whether
Yeah.
or not this is dealt with differently. I do know there's some good research out there about learning to build good timelines.
Mm.
And that the timeline is one of the ways to ward against false accusations. And so, again, I'll put something in the show notes about that for professionals. But it would be a good idea to do some research if you're a professional about how to build a good timeline that can be shown in the court. So if you're an attorney and you have someone who says, I'm being alienated, there are some very specific things to look for. There also is a way to build a timeline to kind of check that out and see whether this would fly in the courtroom. But if you have a really good timeline to show what has happened over a number of years that leads to a conclusion of parental alienation, then, that's awesome.
Yeah.
But if the timeline doesn't prove it, then it's, by the same token, it's pretty awesome to show if you're on the other side, the
Right.
side of being accused, to say this doesn't look anything like parental alienation. This
No.
looks like a parent alienating him or herself from the children. And so all of that is good to know, good to deal with.
The other thing that seems to be adding to the complication is attorneys. I mean, their job is to be a zealot advocate for their client. And if we're not careful, that can include a number of different tools in a toolbox that I can make an accusation or support an accusation to create an impression, whether it's true or not, that's unfavorable to the other side so that my client can win. And I'm wondering if there's anything we can do in a family court system that lessens that. In other words, I can help my client win, but at the expense of the children. I wonder if anybody ever addresses that.
Yeah, and I don't know that I would put that on the attorney's shoulders, because their job is to zealously advocate for their clients, and they're
Right.
going to do exactly what you said
Right.
because they're expected to. And that's the service they provide to their client is, if you say you're innocent, I'm going to help you prove you're innocent.
If you're guilty, then yeah. I mean,
You
the other
know.
side says you're guilty. Yeah, but
So I think this really falls on the court-connected professionals who are charged with doing forensic investigations,
assessments, yeah.
evaluations, custody work, guardians ad litem, psychological evaluators, those kinds of people, to get the right kind of training. I love that you brought up the family court system, because wouldn't it be great if the family court system had someone on staff that said, I'm not on a side, I'm going to evaluate. It's interesting when there are true cases of child abuse, for instance, and the system gets involved, people are more likely to get the help they need through that system than the system that requires both sides to be paying thousands of dollars to their attorneys.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? That there are better systems in place provided to people for the sake of children when people don't have any money.
Yeah.
I've often said, like the case from hell that we presented, had her ex and she had no money and this came up, they would have pretty quickly unsubstantiated the claims and they would have moved on as a divorced family without any, intrusion from the court.
Yep.
But because one parent had a lot of money to
Money.
continue to file claims over and over that were forced to stay in the court system for so long, and like you said, no resolution, that the kids then became more damaged. It's curious to me how crippled this system is when someone has enough money to keep things, in limbo,
Right. Limbo.
which
Yeah.
our child protective services didn't have time for that.
No.
Let's get in there, figure out what's happening, see if we can help somebody, get these kids back to their biological parents as soon as possible, get that reunification happening because we got to move on to the next case, right?
Yes.
And you actually get, I think, better services. I don't know if I should say that because some of the services provided by the system aren't that great, but wouldn't it be great if
Wouldn't
our
it?
system did provide good quality services to address some of these emergency issues
Mhm.
in the court to quickly determine, is it happening or isn't it happening, to preserve the child's psychological well-being.
Yep. It's a complicated issue and we could do better than we're
Yes.
doing. Yep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, we always like to end on a word of hope, right? For those of you who are listening who are being falsely accused of any of the things we're talking about today, I want to just say to you that there is hope, that more than likely, if you had any time at all with your child to bond with them, that bond has been meaningful. And that bond will eventually be meaningful. But what you might have to go through in the meantime is like being swallowed by a whale.
Yes.
It's dark. It feels hopeless. It feels like, okay, this is the end for me. And I'm here to tell you that we have a lot more positive stories, I think, with positive outcomes than you can imagine. It's just we don't hear about those stories after the fact as much.
Right.
Yeah, and I kind of hope that we have talked about this before, but I want to sort of reignite this idea of getting some positive stories on our show, to give parents who are struggling with false accusations a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
Because I think it's probably one of the hardest things to endure is to have what you feel is a good relationship with a child to just be turned upside down by someone who supposedly loves that child.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything worse other than it being true.
Mm.
And it's hard sometimes to determine which is worse.
It's very, very painful. And if you're going through it, don't go through it alone. Don't isolate yourself. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Reach out to a therapist, reach out to a group like ours,
Yes.
the Hump Day group,
Yes.
to just be able to talk about it. And I hope that if you're listening to this, that you will come to our group, because I think that just having other people say, yeah, I went through that, but it did get better, or I was able to reunite with my child, or the court did get it right, is important to hear, that it's not a losing battle completely. So, all right. That was a good discussion, and I really hope that we continue it on some level by maybe getting some people who have positive stories of reunification to chat with us.
That would be great. Yep.
If that's a story you have, we want to hear about it. Okay, Rick. We'll talk to everyone next week.
Bye-bye, everybody.
All right.
Hey, listeners, thanks for listening and tuning in to our podcast. If you're on YouTube, we hope that you'll subscribe to us and like our show. If you've listened audio, we want you to give us a 5-star review. And the reason to do that is so that we can be more available to other listeners. When you give us a positive review, more people can get help. So we'll see you next time. The information contained in this podcast is generic. It must not be misconstrued as constituting legal or psychological advice. Decisions relevant to any specific individual, family system, or case require the direct evaluation of skilled, child-centered professionals.
This podcast was filmed at Podium Studios at Marietta Square. Grow your business with turnkey, professional quality podcasting, live streaming, and online events. Don't worry about editing. Don't worry about anything. Just come in and record. Learn more at thepodium.studio. Step up to the podium.